Now let's focus on this story. It's a child sex abuse case that is being dubbed South Africa's Jeffrey Epstein trial. It involves Paul Kennedy, a top advocate and former evidence leader for the State Capture Commission, who committed suicide at his Johannesburg home in February last year. This after he'd been arrested and charged in connection with allegedly helping to run a child sex ring. Now, this week, his co-accused, Gerard Ackerman, began pleading to over 700 child sex-related charges. Ackerman is accused of providing children for sex to his clients. Now, Kennedy was accused not only of being a client of Ackerman, but also of finding children to participate in the sex ring. It's a truly sickening story, but one that we do need to focus on to understand how such crimes could be committed and what needs to change to stop them. And I'm joined now by children's rights activist Luke Lamprecht from the group Women and Men Against Child Abuse. Luke, this is an awful story to talk about, but at least it is at trial stage and it has been uncovered. Ackerman, of course, stands alone now because Paul Kennedy committed suicide. He's facing something like 730 odd charges, and that includes rape, compelled rape, human trafficking, creating child pornography, among others. I mean, I'm wondering, is this South Africa's biggest child sex ring case to date?
Look, it certainly is in terms of trafficking, numbers, exploitation, sexual assault, and pornography. So it's almost the perfect storm. So if you look at previous cases, you might have somebody who collects pornography, you might have somebody who abuses children. This was people who collected pornography, manufactured pornography, rented children out, rented other boys to have sex with other boys, rented places to have sex with children. It's diabolical because it is so organized, and it is organized within the sort of upper echelons of society, you know, among the Saxon Worlds and the Sandringhams of Johannesburg.
How difficult is it to uncover a case like this? I was reading about it in a number of articles, and it said that it seems to have played out between September 2020 and July 2021, which interestingly was during some of our toughest lockdown times. But is there a strong possibility that these actions, the sex ring existed long before that?
Look, we have actually no doubt that it existed before that. So Mr. Ackerman in particular is facing charges in the Alexandra court. So that's Alexandra Joburg, where he had allegedly lured a child into a toilet, pretending to have a broken arm, and sexually assaulted him in the toilet. We have charges going, which in fact are, in the High Court had become part of these proceedings, where there's cases in Cape Town, the South Coast. So this is a prolific ring. It's certainly a national ring. And if you look at the pornography, it looks like an international ring. And it certainly predates the disclosures we have in this case.
So let's talk about Paul Kennedy. He, of course, committed suicide. Apparently, he was out on bail at the time. A very well-known advocate, even an acting judge at one time. He even appeared as an evidence leader during the State Capture Commission. What is known about his alleged involvement?
Okay, so there's two things around it that are important to understand around his alleged involvement. The first is that when he was arrested with his co-accused, it was made known to the Johannesburg Magistrates Court that the accused, Mr. Ackerman, was actually out on bail on the case I mentioned in the Alexandra court, and he nonetheless got bail. Now, there has to have been something in terms of, kind of the profile of Advocate Kennedy, that this person, Mr. Ackerman, gets bail while he's out on bail. So that made no sense. So there's something about the influence that he had that, made that bail application, happen, which makes no sense legally. The second part is that there are various levels at which he has been implicated. So firstly, he's implicated in hiring boys from Mr. Ackerman in order to have sex with him. He's then implicated in hiring young men. So in other words, just adults, so sort of the young, I'm talking about 18, 19, 20-year-olds, to have sex with other boys, the children, while he watched, and he then masturbated to that because that was his thing. So he's hiring other young men, and that's for compelled rape charges. So there's rape charges, compelled rape charges, and then that was filmed, that's pornography charges. So he's implicated in the entire process that happened here, plus facilitating other men to be with these boys. So he's implicated across the board. There was actually a very interesting and a sort of very complex part of the initial proceedings when he was still alive, where there was a request for blood tests to be drawn. Now, blood tests are taken for things like DNA and semen samples and HIV, etc. And it was once those blood results were made available that he committed suicide. So he's implicated on every level in these cases.
I suppose the other side of this is that the fact that this trial has come to court is a bit of a victory for children's rights, because sometimes when you see the involvement of a high-profile figure, they can exert influence to avoid the law. But how difficult is it going to be to prosecute, bearing in mind that I would imagine they'll have to get testimony from a number of minors who have already been abused, who are likely still traumatized?
Absolutely. So how we understand this coming to light is that, and in other cases I've dealt with, so this hasn't been alleged, so at the moment I'm speculating, is that young boys who were abused, so they're abused as boys, and then they become adults. In other words, they are now 18 and older. They then use those boys to abuse the younger boys who are still children, and those boys, one of those boys is actually who reported the case. And then one of the child victims, who's now still a child, that child in turn then has made a statement, who mentioned other children, who then mentioned all these unknown, of which there are multiple, unknown male, what they call clients, which are called users of children for sexual abuse. And these children, fortunately, have been very, very well managed by the state. And I have to really commend the state in this regard, because the evidence that was led today was from a colonel who spoke about the trauma that these boys have suffered. So what we are doing is we are preparing as a country and as a sort of as the state's case, we are preparing the court for the fact that the victims that you will see are severely traumatized young boys. So I think the way the state has proceeded in this case really needs to be commended, because we're very quick to, kind of say the state is bad and, the police don't do their jobs and the prosecutors don't do their jobs. They've really managed it well. And the first thing they presented was this colonel who is explaining to the court how traumatized these boys actually are.
Yeah. And just lasting trauma as well. Let's focus as well on another case which may also suggest that the state is starting to make progress. Recently, we've heard about this retired teacher, David Price. He was arrested here in South Africa, but related to that, charges in South Africa and in Britain when he was working at various schools. And in fact, I believe he actually taught Boris Johnson at one of these schools, just as a sideline. He's due in court here in February. Is this another sign that perhaps the South African authorities are really starting to make inroads in these difficult to prosecute but utterly critical cases?
Absolutely. And I mean, I need to again commend both the British government as well as our government in how they've dealt with these cases, because these are complex cases. So there are actually two offenders. It's called the Price-Wares matter. So I don't know if they did or did not know one another, but they were charged in 2019. And they were charged because they were charged in the UK and they're in South Africa, and they should have been extradited. Now, the problem is COVID was happening at that point in time. And as a result of COVID, they actually are not being held in custody while awaiting extradition to the UK. But we had young, well, they're now not so young, obviously, they're more my age. We had men come forward who were very young in South Africa when they were abused by those two teachers in this country. And to commend the South African police, within a day or two of the case being made by a local man who was a boy when abused by Price. They actually arrested him and brought him to court. Again, he's out on bail. I don't quite understand how people get bail. I understand he's an old man, but I don't quite understand how they get bail, because he's awaiting extradition on charges in the UK, and he's now facing charges here, but yet he's still got bail. So that's probably the only thing I have a bit of a challenge around, because what message are we sending if these guys are sort of roaming around since 2016 with the cases, and 2019 with the extradition, and now new cases, and we still allow them to roam around? So if I had one complaint, I would say that, really with a profile like that, including Mr. Ackerman, why are they not awaiting trial in jail?
Yeah, good point. Look, I have to ask you, and this is something that I think just beggars belief. You look at someone like Paul Kennedy, and bearing in mind, yes, he never went to trial, he committed suicide. So I suppose we won't know for sure exactly what his side of the story was. But if indeed it is true that he was directly involved in this child sex ring, at the same time, he was an advocate, at times an acting judge, participated in the Zondo Commission. So a man who knew the law, who fought for justice, and yet allegedly did these horrific things to children. You've worked a lot with abuse cases, Luke. Do you understand how someone's psyche works? Because it staggers us. You sort of think, but you know the law. How can you? Would it be possible to look at someone like that and see there was something wrong? Or do they compartmentalize their crimes to the extent that you would never know?
All right. So I have a very long answer to this, but I'm going to give you sort of the short version. Firstly, what we have to understand is that there's a concept called a career offender. Now, a career offender is a person who chooses jobs that gives them access to children. That's the one part of it. But the other side of it equally is that they make a career of abusing children. Now, that sounds like a horrible thing for me to say, but it's entirely true. And the motive that they have is they enjoy having sex with children. Their motive is sexual. So anything else about a bad childhood or they were abused is an excuse for their behavior. So the average person, now if we take any case, you can pick a case, we can take St. Andrews, we can take, any of the cases that we know that we've had in Parktown, many of the cases we've had multiple cases of abuse, is that the average career offender that was interviewed while incarcerated, the study was done in the US, will tell us that they've abused between 300 and 400 children before they get caught. Now, the reason that happens is that us as a society engage in various levels of denial. And we engage in denial of fact, it's not possible, which happened in the St. Andrews case, denial of impact, it's not so bad, I really love the boys, I was just doing this. And then denial of responsibility, these were disadvantaged boys, they wanted to do this, whatever. Now, what we have to understand is the reason that we find it so hard to believe that this is possible is because they walk among us. And it is not the monsters that we see on the sides of the road that abuse children. It is those who walk among us. And the reason they choose these professions is to create a facade that allows them access.
Wow, they walk among us. That is a chilling thought, but an important one for us to engage with. Thank you so much for speaking to us this evening. Children's rights activist Luke Lamprecht of the group Women and Men Against Child Abuse.